secret police recordings, a toppled authoritarian government in Nicaragua, and Mexico City's first gay pride parade. How do these three things go together? In honor of Pride Month, we're learning from an expert who's connected the dots. Today on Across the Fence. Hello, Vermont. I know firsthand the joy of discovering a story hidden within a story. How exciting and rewarding it is when, in the course of doing research, you find another whole topic lurking within the tale you originally sought to tell. For my guest, that's how today's story began. And it's a perfect story for Pride Month as we commemorate the contributions, resilience, and culture of the LGBTQ community. Today, Pride takes us to Mexico in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Next week, we'll be back in Vermont, but way back in time with a love story from the early 19th century. But joining me today to talk about queer solidarity and Central American revolutions is Sarah Osten, an associate professor of history at UVM, who's the director of UVM's Latin American and Caribbean Studies program and an expert on Mexico's political left in the 20th century. Dr. Sarah Osten, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. I think this is such a great story. So kick us off. It's the late 1970s in Mexico. What is the political landscape like?
It was a really interesting time in Mexico and in Latin America in general, because it was really a period throughout the region of a lot of really brutal right-wing authoritarian regimes. And Mexico looked a little bit different. It was an authoritarian regime that tends to get described by scholars as soft authoritarian. Sometimes it got described as a single-party democracy. But you had this ruling party that came to power in 1929 and governed Mexico until 2000.
That's PRI, right?
Yeah. So the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. And for rulers of Mexico, they were really proud that they weren't a military authoritarian regime like Chile or Argentina or Brazil. But for people living under what was really in its own right an authoritarian regime, it was a time where people were really starting to push for change. And Mexico, because it had its revolution in the 19-teens, it was just sort of on a different timeline than the rest of Latin America. So, you start getting real change for democracy and democratization across Latin America. And then Mexico was really late. Mexico didn't democratize until 2000.
And then what's happening in Central America at the same time?
So in Central America, in the Cold War period, in most of the region, you have really brutal military authoritarian regimes that are supported by the United States, in some cases brought to power by the United States. And then really following the Cuban revolutionary example, starting in the 1960s and 70s, you get armed leftist guerrilla movements that seek to overthrow these US-supported military regimes.
Yeah. And so that's also setting up this situation in Mexico, where there's activists in Mexico, and Mexico itself is also feeling like it needs to show some solidarity with these different types of Central American revolutions?
Yeah, in Mexico, and this is what really drew me to this project in the first place, you have this strange paradox where the ruling party, the semi-authoritarian regime, calls itself the Institutional Revolutionary Party, referring to a revolution that happened in the 19-teens and 1920s, and is under all of this pressure to democratize. They're in the middle of a pretty severe economic crisis by the late 1970s, and they really want to be revindicated as revolutionary themselves. So they see these revolutions happening in Central America, and they say, we're going to support them. Including because for our own citizens, it would be really hypocritical if we didn't, because we're trying to prove to our own citizens that we're revolutionary.
It's such an interesting sort of tension in what's going on in all these groups. And then, so what are the goals of the left in Latin America at this point in time, right? This moment in Latin American history?
So it's a really interesting time because, for the left, the biggest thing that happens in the 20th century is the Cuban Revolution in 1959.
Right.
You have this little...
It's the shining example of revolution.
Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, the way they present it to the world is they just had this little group of really brave, heroic revolutionaries that overthrew this US-supported dictator. And there's a lot of truth in that story. But they really tried to export that model to the rest of the world, including very actively. Che died in Bolivia trying to start a similar revolution, but it never worked anywhere else. And so by the 1970s, people were still trying to find the revolutionary model that was going to work to combat all of these really brutal right-wing authoritarian regimes, but the Cuban model hadn't worked anywhere else. And you start getting a new global awareness about human rights abuses, including against gay men in Cuba. So the left by the 1970s, the global left, but especially the Latin American left, is really looking for a new revolutionary model, a new way to, again, confront these really brutal authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, and that story, like the left story, that was what you originally started investigating.
So originally, this project, the book I'm writing, was going to be about how Mexico welcomed leftist exiles from the rest of Latin America, even though it was itself repressing its own left in those years, because I thought that was just really interesting and said something really fascinating about Mexico.
Yeah. And then you started, but then you start actually finding this other, like something else starts popping out at you in the story.
Well, part of what happened is that one of my main sources for this project was Mexico's secret police archives. And I went into the archives, in retrospect it makes so much sense, I went into the archives looking for state surveillance of revolutionary exiles from other countries, and of course discovered that what the Mexican secret police was really interested in was surveilling Mexican citizens. So it became a project about Mexican radical leftist solidarity with Central American revolutions in the 1970s and the 1980s.
And so some of what's then coming out then is that there are certain characters, certain people who keep showing up. And what did you learn about them?
So the first thing that happened, which led me to the project we're talking about today, is I was just sort of in the archive. I never have as much time as I want in the archive. I sort of had blinders on, just sort of looking at whatever Central America solidarity stuff I could find. And after a few days, I realized that the archive was pulling me, which is what you want. You want the archive to lead you. But I sort of came home from the archive one day and thought to myself, lesbians are coming up a lot, which I didn't expect. You know, I'm a historian of revolutionary movements and the left, but I am not I'm not someone who specializes in queer history. It's not something I went into the archive expecting to find. At first, I sort of assumed that it was these you know, conservative, reactionary, homophobic police, sort of using lesbian as a pejorative for leftist activist women with short hair wearing pants. And then I realized, no, it was communist lesbians marching in the streets in Mexico City in the 1970s and 1980s, demanding freedom for oppressed people in Central America.
Well, so what was it like to be queer in Mexico at this moment in time?
It was still a very repressive time. Mexico, like most of the world at that time, was still a very homophobic place. It wasn't really until the late 1970s where you start having openly gay and lesbian public figures in Mexico. That was still sort of a new thing. But part of what's happening in Mexico at this time is you have a lot of grassroots movements pushing for radical change in Mexico. And so for gay and lesbian activists at that time, I think there was a lot of hope that things could start to change. And they were very connected with a global queer left also, including in the United States.
Which is aligning on this idea that liberation is for everyone.
Exactly.
Right? So that you can't parse the liberation and say liberation for some people, so that then gay rights also falls as a piece of human liberation.
Right, and it was really important for them that the Mexican left understand gay and lesbian people as particularly oppressed. Oppressed in the way that all Mexicans were lacking in political freedom in this authoritarian context, but then also repressed again as gay people, and then in the case of lesbians, repressed again as women.
So this is the context then for the first celebrations of Gay Pride in Mexico City. And you've got some amazing posters that we're going to take a look at. First Gay Pride is in 1979?
1979. And what was really striking to me, because I came to this story about the radical gay and lesbian left in Mexico through the lens of Central America solidarity activism, is that the first gay pride parade happens 2 weeks before the Sandinista revolution defeats the Somoza regime in Nicaragua. So there's this brief period where there's just so much excitement among activists that things can really change.
Yeah.
It's a time of a lot of hope and aspiration for everybody in the sort of dissident radical left.
Yeah. Well, actually, and how did the left in Mexico respond to gay active, or like to their solidarity?
Ambivalently. You know, the Cold War was a time where, you know, communists in the United States were homophobically smeared as gay, and capitalists in the communist world were smeared as gay. Homosexuality was sort of this marker of outsider status. And so for the Stalinist left, including in the Soviet Union, including in Cuba, those were really homophobic states. And so it was really hard for gay and lesbian leftists to find a comfortable place in communist parties.
Yeah. Well, so I know that very broadly your work as a historian focuses on revolutionary politics. Did this current research, did this change the way that you think about queer activism, for example?
I would say it really changed how I think about the left. You know, so in Mexico, the traditional old line Mexican Communist Party very publicly and viciously rejected queer activists from joining them. And it was the Trotskyist Party of Mexico that was founded in the mid-1970s that was the first political party to welcome gay and lesbian people.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Well, okay, so we only have a tiny bit more, so I actually want to close with a question. So there's so much more we could talk about, but you are the only professor of Latin American studies at UVM, which and you can tell from this conversation, you have to cover, therefore, a lot of ground. What's it like to be the only professor of Latin American studies?
It's sort of half lonely. I'm not the only professor of Latin American studies. I'm the only professor of Latin American history.
Correct.
It's a little bit lonely, but it's also a lot of freedom because I get to teach the stuff that I'm interested in. I'm certainly responsible for teaching a really broad spectrum of things. I can't only teach about Mexican politics as much as I would like to. But because I'm the only one teaching Latin American history, I get to sort of choose what I want to do.
And the freedom to sort of follow the research where it takes you.
Yeah.
And sometimes like into amazing stories just like this.
And follow things my students are interested in. You know, I have a whole class on drug trafficking.
Very good. Awesome. Well, Dr. Osten, thank you so much for joining me today. And thanks for sharing this story. I think this one is a really important one for us to just hear and think more deeply about, right? Like the roots of what queer solidarity has looked like all over the world. Amazing. Okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And as always, thank you, Vermont, for learning and exploring with me today. And thanks to the team that makes Across the Fence possible. I'm Amy Finley. This is Across the Fence. Come back and let's learn and explore again tomorrow.